Hello and welcome. This is quite a short video than normal, probably. It's probably only stretched to about an hour and a half. We're going to be covering the basics and army composition and how to generally build your army, which is definitely something a lot of people can struggle with, and it is the most determining factor. It doesn't matter how well you play, if you have a bad army, you're going to struggle to be able to use it. So we're going to be going over all the ways you can construct an army, where you need to start off, what you need to consider, and just general tips and tricks on what to do and what not to do. You're going to be using greenskins as a template because they have a very varied roster and they are very popular these days. They're also the one that we don't have a recording for the composition, so we can go through some of the units there. So yeah, well, with any good army, you need to start off with your lord, of course. Greenskins have a pretty good variety, but there are some factions with fewer and more options. Norse could come to mind, they don't have many options. But greenskins are quite lucky that nearly all of their lord options are quite powerful and quite good, both utility and in just general usage with their stats and melee strength. You have caster hybrid lords such as the Goblin Great Shaman, who you can throw on a different mount variants. You have Azag, you have Wurzag, all pretty decent melee combatants, and some have quite poor leadership, which is a common theme that you need to always keep in mind whenever building your army, is the strengths and weaknesses of your units. Not usually the faction as a whole. Sometimes you just need to look at the units that you're bringing and what sort of common weaknesses they all have. But starting off first with the Lord. For example, here we'll take Wurzag, because when you take Wurzag, you are dealing with both your magic and your Lord in one option. Say if you bring a non-caster Lord, such as Grom, Grimgor, Skarsnik, then you start to have to consider which heroes you have to take, because of course you need a caster. Otherwise you lose access to quite a powerful resource, which your enemies probably can have access to, so you should probably have access to it as well. Otherwise you're just losing out on that precious magic. So, starting off with Wurzag. One thing to consider, generally speaking, mounts are always a better option than foot lords these days. Wurzag especially, because he's a squishy caster lord with very little armor and very little melee defense. You do not want things to catch him, so getting an extra 34 speed, always want to throw him on your mount. This goes with any caster, not just any lord. This goes with any hero that you don't want to die. Yeah, generally, you just put him on a mount. Helps out quite a bit. Welcome Grim and Castrel. So generally, yeah, mount is what you need. You also need to consider what it is, like the weaknesses that your lord has. Of course, with 55 armor, he's going to be quite vulnerable, and no missile resistance at all, only a physical resistance. He is going to be very vulnerable to missiles and any kind of sniping potential. So his mount is key in keeping him alive. If you just stand still, then it's not going to go very well for him unless you hide him in trees. Now, the cost of your lord is also another thing you need to consider. Obviously, if you're putting all your eggs in one basket, you better hope that it's worth it. We've been over magic guides and why it's a good idea not to take all your spells. But if you make your lord, especially, it's already a bad thing to lose your lord. If you put all of your money into your lord, then all of a sudden, if your lord dies, the game is over. Taking Wurzag obviously is on the cheaper end of really expensive lords. If we look at something like Malekith, for example, if you get him to his most expensive capabilities, 4,000 gold, that's a third of your money gone if he gets taken down. So there is such a thing as putting too many eggs in one basket. There's no need to pour all of that money into one sort of area. It can definitely pay out. Some lords are very capable of paying back for themselves, but it tends to be that more expensive lords, you want to try and skim down as much as possible. When it comes to cheaper lords, like you'll notice Grom is pretty good just as he is, standard. You don't need to really add much onto him. Lucky Banner is about all you really need. And he already does pretty good on his own. He's not a caster, so that does have to factor in the fact that you need to bring money. You need to bring a additional hero caster, which is again more money that you're pouring into things. But by having your lord and hero separated in your magic department, you can put fewer eggs in one basket. Like if your lord gets sniped, at least you don't lose your source of magic at the same time. But going back to Wurzag, because at the end of the day, if you have a hybrid caster lord, then you are putting more eggs in one basket, but you're also putting fewer eggs overall. You're putting a lot less money into your magic and leadership department as you would normally, as if you were bringing Grom with his items along with a caster. You can see that built up quite a lot more than say Wurzag would do just on his own. So obviously bringing Mosaic, you have to consider the spells. This goes with any spellcaster. You have to consider the strengths and weaknesses of your lore. So obviously, the Big War we covered last week. If you want to go look at that video, we obviously can tell it's very supportive. Has some decent offensive spells, but it's the huge melee attack buffs with Here We Go, and Wurzag himself can apply extra melee attack to all units on his side. Because of things like this, he generally favours a very wide army, because obviously if you have the more units you have, the more units that are going to be affected by the Bonewood Staff. So there's always things you need to take in mind with how your Lord can function with your army composition. So taking obviously again Wurzag here as the general baseline, if we're up against High Elves, obviously Wurzag a bit weak to all those High Elves missiles, but we want to bring him because we get all those melee attack buffs. It means that even Goblins can clear through like Sylvan Guard really quickly. If you give them Here We Go and Bonewood Staff, boom, they'll be through it instantly. So all you really need is those Goblins, because you have to consider Goblins are obviously a very good chaff unit with their silver shield. You need to consider that the High Elves have a lot of missiles, a lot of archers, a lot of things that you want to be absorbed, ideally. And typically Goblins should absorb a good chunk of damage. Even if it's just absorbing a cavalry charge, that's all they're there for, realistically. But the thing is, with Wurzag's ability and his spells, he can absolutely increase their damage output by quite a large scale. And with a baseline of 26 melee defense, which is not bad for a 300 gold unit, Goblins can generally get a lot done in a Wurzag focused army, so long as he brings his Bonewood Staff. Because obviously plus 12 melee attack, that puts their melee attack to 32, which are 300 gold, 32 and 26 in stats is very good, especially with a silver shield. Sorry, just need to take a drink. So always think about, you can have multiple lines of defense, but if you are bringing expensive units or units that perhaps aren't shielded, you typically want to bring a chaff line in front just to absorb as much damage as possible. So say for this instance, we might want some Black Orcs. Black Orcs are quite hard to deal with these days because heavy cavalry doesn't do much to them if they countercharge. Similar problem with Vestigors and etc, etc. So say we have a front line of Goblins just to absorb missiles and to absorb the cavalry charges, and then Black Orcs themselves, they have enough armor that High Elf missiles won't do much, but they do not have any shield or missile resistance. So it's important to make sure that those Goblins are eating the first wave of arrows. As much as the damage as possible should go into the Goblins, because as you can see, the Goblins have a pretty good health pool. Like Black Orcs are one of the highest health infantry units in the game, at 8,100, and the Goblins only have 1,300 less, which for 300 gold is a lot of health. So you want to make full use of that health bar as much as possible. Now obviously, Goblins, terrible leadership, they will run, and that's another thing you have to keep in mind, whether or not you want to keep certain units near him, so such as Wurzag. Wurzag of course can buff the leadership of everything near him with Here We Go and with his incorrigibility. So whenever you see your frontline Goblins start to falter, it could be a good idea to move Wurzag in, just near the back line, so that they get that leadership buff, but also keep aware that you obviously don't want to get him into the line of fire too much. You obviously also get encouraged from your other hero squads. Obviously we have a caster already here, so we probably wouldn't need another one. Some problems that there can be with High Elves is there can be eagles and such, so we can take magic missiles and general just bust spells to help that front line even more. Foot of Gork won't hit much. Edbert doesn't do an awful lot, and Brainbuster, you can take it on or off in this matchup. Really up to you at the end of the day. But a lot of the High Elf Lords typically kind of lightly armoured, apart from the obvious Tyrion and Imeric and Eltharion. But say Teclis, Alariel, Elithanar, there's a lot of caster heroes that can be taken. And there's also the capabilities of Eagles and War Lions, which don't have the highest armour, Arcane Phoenixes as well. So because of that, it can be a good idea to bring a Goblin Big Boss. Usually, of course, again on the mounted, because that helps you catch things. Whether or not you bring that on the Spider or the Wolf is up to you. Generally, I like bringing on the Spider because of the poison buff and because you get more armour and health. But here we have a really cheap option, only 600 gold. You can also sometimes drop this and this even if you really don't want it. For 500 gold, we're having something that can very capably threaten High Elf leadership and heroes and monsters quite reliably. So it's always And when you've not hit your hero cap, you have to think like, is there a hero worth bringing that isn't impeding your cost? So for instance, Black Orc Big Boss, also a pretty good choice in this matchup. There is a dragon could ruin a lot of this army. Whereas like himself, I believe, has Frenzy, but he is not immune to psychology, so if his leadership drops below 50%, he will be able to be terror routed. So keeping a Black Orc Big Boss near those units that can get terror routed is quite important, because you will usually see a High Elf Dragon or a Phoenix, which can of course terror rout your units. So this is the hero cap. This is the pretty good hero squad to have against High Elves, in my opinion. He himself is also quite armoured and shielded, so... Oh, cough. High Elf missiles won't do that much to him. But again, put him on his mount, because then he can catch things. So again, if we look at the infantry line, we can see we have the Chaffee front line along with a back line of more elite units. Whether or not you go 2 or 3 or just how much money you put into things, generally speaking, this is a good balance of how much money you should be spending on a front line. Of course, it varies with the faction. Obviously, Greenskins are quite an infantry-focused faction, so they typically want a lot of that melee infantry, especially when you're bringing the Bonewood Staff to bear. You want a quite wide army as much as possible, just because of this one item. So a lot of lords and heroes will have access to items that can really change the exact style of your play, and that can really benefit from certain builds. Of course, Bonewood Staff really benefits from a nice wide army build. So I'd say an army, how much money is that? About 3,000 or so? More than that. Nearly 4,000 of your gold. In this situation is probably just a fine amount to put into your frontline infantry, just because the Greenskins are not only a focused faction on melee infantry, but Wurzag himself buffs it quite a bit with his Bonewood Staff. Typically, I think it does vary on build to build, but as a typical like High Elf frontline would only be about 2,000 gold. 2,000, I think usually between 2,000 and 3,000 is about the gold you'd be spending on your frontline. But it is always important to have some gold to spare in these situations. Of course, High Elves can bring flying units, like we said, dragons and such, and there's nothing here really that can threaten them, apart from the occasional poke and prod from Gaze of Mork. So definitely important to bring some form of archer unit in nearly any army. There's not really any situation, apart from Vampire Counts, where you don't want to bring some ranged units, because they always come in handy. And there's always that risk that your enemy can bring something that can only really be damaged by missile attacks, or that could be punished very poorly for missile attacks. So always bring missile infantry or missile cavalry. It doesn't matter, as long as you have something that can either threaten a flying unit. It does vary depending on what faction you're up against, but missiles are always worth taking. I don't think there's there is the occasional matchup where you don't need missiles, but 90% of the time you want some missiles. So in this situation, I'd say, because High Elf Cavalry is quite a threat to our missile units, the missile infantry, because they'll lose mostly, it's probably a good idea just to take some Forest Goblin Spider Riders, some Wolf Riders. Spider Riders can slow down any High Elf Cavalry, and I think they should be able to escape from most of the units. Goblin Wolf Riders will escape easily on their own. I think Morgrub's Mangy Marauders, also a good choice because of that AP. A lot of High Elf stuff, especially when it comes to dragons, are quite armoured. So you do want that armour piercing against the High Elves, in my opinion. And when you think about it, the only thing that can really threaten these 3 units, this is why Greenskin Missile Cavalry itself is actually quite strong, is because the only thing that can really threaten these is archers themselves, or counter skirmish, which the High Elves don't have as good access to. Illyrian Reavers or archers will not be able to out skirmish this sort of Greenskin skirmish claw. Looking as well at cavalry and chariots, this is a lot more optional when it comes to your depending on your playstyle. Obviously, every army needs a front line. Every army needs its missile infantry. Even a skirmish army will typically have some front line just to be there, or just to keep running away, just so that they have something just in case a quick unit gets in between into areas that you don't want them to be in. So obviously, Lord heroes are an optional part, but typically you always usually want a hero, at least one. Infantry, of course, a necessity. Missiles, we've been through, need a necessity. Cavalry itself, cavalry, chariots, far more optional. You do not necessarily need to put your money into cavalry depending on the matchup. Obviously, certain matchups Like for instance here, against the High Elves have some quite good cavalry, and these days cavalry isn't that good. So the best we can really hope for is probably the highest, most expensive I would go personally is Night Goblin Squigs, just to run off enemy infantry that's fleeing, or to go after archers that are in the back line, because you do want something just back there just to cycle charge into the back, do as much damage as possible without getting into any serious combat. And in this situation, that is probably all you need. You could just cheapen it up a bit more and just go with basic Spider Riders, but of course they won't perform quite as well. But that does leave you money for other areas. In this situation, when you know that the cavalry fight is usually already won by your enemy, you don't need to. You want to prioritize fast-moving, harassing cav as opposed to big, heavy cav that you know that's just going to get caught and it's going to lose 90% of the time. Especially if a dragon swoops in and just fire breathes on all of it. Scrolling down again, monsters and beasts. Quite a strong part of the greenskin roster, however, in this matchup, not that good. Obviously we've talked about why High Elf missiles are quite good. High Elves also have quite a bit of anti-large available to them that can threaten these big slow moving monsters. None of the monsters in the greenskin rosters are particularly fast. Like the fastest you're going to get is an Arachnok Spider, and that's not going to get away from Dragon Princes anytime soon. So it's very easy to be caught. Not going to be running through front lines like a Brood Horror or a Doom Wheel. Just quite a slow, methodical thing, mainly made for just running in and trying to do some damage. But if they get pinned down, which they can quite easily get pinned down, trolls will get pinned down and then run away, and then will proceed to get chased off very easily because you won't have the cavalry advantage. Giants themselves, very little armor. You have to consider what your opponent is always bringing. It's missiles. He's a high elf. He's an elf. He's going to bring missiles. 30 armor is not enough, and there is no missile resistance, so a giant is a terrible idea. Arachnok Spiders can be a good idea against the High Elves because of course they have a lot of quite powerful large, and most of their missiles are not armor piercing. Their only really armor piercing missiles are, as we said, Sisters of Avalon. Here they are, and they are quite an expensive option that you don't normally see that much of. So it can be a good bet to bring an Arachnok, but again, it's 120 armor, so regular archers won't do that much damage to it, but it has no missile resistance, no shielding, no nothing like that. So if you do bring an Arachnok Spider, you have to make sure that you've put that extra money into the backline harassing, so you have more money in squigs, but then you have to start consider where you have to take your money away. Because this is a pretty good army overall, we're a bit over, so if we drop, say, the Orc Boys and a unit of Goblins, we have a sort of layout like this. This is a pretty decent army, all things considered. A good amount of money put into the infantry, it's fairly wide, so we benefit from the Bonewood Staff. A lot of it is going to be in melee as well, so the Bonewood Staff will always generally be helpful. We have a good missile core that can scare off flying units or just provide some good counter skirmish in case they bring their own skirmish cavalry. And we have some good backline harassers because Eagle Claw bolt throwers, archers, or just something that's not anti-large infantry, so like White Lines of Trace, all good targets for these Night Goblin Squigs, which are of course armor piercing and anti-infantry. Also their immunity psychology can come in handy against dragons and such. And we have the Arachnok Spider just to follow up in case of any cavalry that gets stuck into our infantry if they go really heavy in cavalry and they try to just cycle charge with the Black Orcs. Obviously that won't work for them these days, but at some point it will. The Arachnok Spider is there to take out cavalry or a dragon. If a dragon lord, you probably want to stick the Arachnok near Wurzag a lot of the time, because of course the Arachnok doesn't have the greatest leadership. It is immune to terror because it causes terror itself, so you want to keep it near either the Black Orc Big Boss or Wurzag, just so that it can keep giving it here we go and that constant encourage so that it stays in the fight. Because in this sort of army, the last thing you want to do is to see your big expensive Arachnok Spider run, because it's very likely your enemy will have either a Dragon Lord or a fast moving caster or cavalry of their own where they can just run it off even though it's at like half health and it hasn't got any value left. That is a very painful sight to see for any greenskin player. Next, after thinking about the monsters that we should bring, is another thing you can usually consider last, is artillery. Now the greenskin artillery isn't particularly amazing. We also have chariots here. Chariots fall much into the same vein as backline harassers and cavalry, although these days chariots are pretty good, so would consider always bringing them against certain factions. We'll go over just how chariots can be used later when I go through the Beastmen roster. But looking at just how things are with this current build, honestly, artillery not really required. When you also consider that bolt throwers will snipe greenskin artillery quite efficiently. If they bring a single bolt thrower, there's nothing a Goblin Rock Lobber or a Doom Diver is going to really be able to do to it, because it does excel at sniping artillery. So, another optional thing, they can definitely turn the tides of battle. We'll have a quick look at that when we switch over to Beastmen. But again, another optional thing, you don't really need to be spending your money necessarily unless you're a really focused ranged faction and you have the right map for it. Which brings me on to a final thing to consider. Now, this final thing to consider is the map, of course. People often select unit info and will usually only ever look at this for the entirety of their army selection. So it's important to go back. I wish there was a separate tab that said map, just so it was more obvious than settings, because it is quite easy to miss. It's always important to go and look at what the map is that you're going to be fighting on. Now, typically, you do this first, and then you have it in the back of your mind. That is probably the better idea to do. I have a nasty habit of just looking at it last and then looking at my army and thinking, yeah, this'll do. But there is definitely situations where I'll look at my army or look at the map after I look at my army, and I'll notice that certain things won't work out. For instance, on this map, the Bleak Coast Isles South is a really long map. It doesn't really say that in the map. I only know this from prior experience. It's a very long map. It's got 2 forests either side of this really long stretch of land, which can be used to hide in from artillery fire. But it is a long map, so typically artillery does have a pretty good part to play here. Knowing this, though, I think this army still works quite well. It's just all about considering how to use them. Obviously, the Ragnarok Spider is at risk of Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower fire, but it has Strider, so it can just move through these forests easily, and it can minimise the damage it might be taking. That goes with Wurzag, or Blackhawk Big Bosses, or just whatever you don't want to get sniped by either fireballs, magic missiles, or artillery. You just move into trees. Trees are our friends. Trees protect. Trees prevent the snipe. So that is it for looking through a basic greenskin army. So this is a situation I feel pretty comfortable going into this matchup with this army, I'd say. You've got the caster hybrid lord. You're paying for both your caster and your lord all in one. You have a reliable assassin that can threaten quite a bit of the high elf leadership core for a very cheap price. And worst case scenario, you can just use his debuff so that they get worse, so that he can stand more of a chance, move some money around. We have a Blackrock Big Boss to make sure things that don't get terror routed and just to keep leadership up. Of course, funds can be moved around wherever they're needed. Whether you're considering using armies or any items is just about moving around funds. So there you just saw I took away an Orc Boys unit and replaced it with a Goblin unit, just so that I could afford get back here. Because it is a quite helpful leadership tool that is needed in this army, because most stuff doesn't have very high leadership. The only exception really being the Black Orcs. The Black Orcs have the highest leadership here by far. So you definitely want that encourage and both of those get back here's, just so that you can fully take effect of that leadership weakness that you have. It's quite important to note just how everything here has like about less than 60 leadership. Nothing here has a particularly high leadership at all. And that is an important weakness to take note of in your army. So obviously the Black Orcs will be the standing backbone. Goblins are just there to take as much damage as possible, while the Black Orcs do a good chunk of the damage. Although with Wurzag's Here We Go Bone Staff, that will mean that Goblins can actually dish out way more damage than they should be able to. And Black Orcs will just destroy everything, because their melee attack will get to an insane amount. With that weapon strength, that's armor piercing, and the armor and the health pool, they'll just tear through everything. Night Goblins Quick Hoppers, we could probably vanguard somewhere on this map, in the trees, just hidden out of the way, so that the enemy doesn't notice. That way they're more likely to leave their backs exposed, because they'll think it's all clear. And we have the Skirmish Corps again, because we need the missiles, and so that we can reliably just poke and prod at the enemy. A Ragnarok Spider is there as a good center hold, just to scare off any dragons from just landing in our Black Orcs, or from any scary cavalry blobs that might try and threaten them. Alright then, onto a different scenario. If we go to a different map, where is it? I just saw it a minute ago. MP, cross, nope, Alpine Ridge. And we'll change the matchup to Beastmen versus, oh what was it? Empire. That was the one. Right. So again, we can see here, Beastmen with their update got access to quite a few more viable lords. Beforehand it was really just Morga, but these days there is a lot more options, which definitely helps them out quite a bit. Throwing a good example here, and probably the better choice in this matchup is again still going to be Morga. His Chaos Spawn summons mean that he can reliably function as just a backline harasser, and can cleave through a lot of infantry quite easily with his Chaos Spawn summons. So obviously in this situation, starting off with Morga, he is of course not a caster. Always remember that. Because your lord is not a caster, that means you need to bring one in your hero core. For this example, we'll bring a Brave Shaman of Beasts with his Tuskor Chariot because it's overpowered, and with Manticore Summon and Flock of Doom. The Jagged Dagger, look back at our Beastmen replay just so you know why all these units are good and why these items are specifically the ones I'm bringing. Look back at our magic session over Lord of the Wilds if you want to know why I'm bringing these spells. Of course, when you have to bring a caster along with your lord, that does limit you to basically one other hero option. In this situation, it's probably a good idea to bring a Wargore with the Tuskor Chariot with varying abilities, probably this one. Now, you might think the matchup is very much bad for chariots because cannons, rifles, that sort of thing is a really big threat to chariots. The thing is chariots these days are doing quite well, but beyond that, this map is very much favoured in the Beastmen's favour. A lot of Empire missiles are very straight firing, means they don't have an arc of fire, and even if they did have an arc of fire, firing over this hill is very difficult. Which really does help the Beastmen in this situation because it means cannons, rifles, even honestly most artillery is fairly useless on this map. Just because unless they really deploy far back, which in case they're probably going to break banner rules, they can't make full use of their artillery before the enemy reaches them. So in this situation we can definitely bring these chariots with very little risk to them at all. Like worst case scenario, they get netted and then shot a bit, but it's unlikely that any missiles are going to be that effective. Morgor himself is very, very, very missile resistant, 75% missile resistance, so he's not going to be dying to missiles anytime soon either. Which is the Empire's main tool of sniping, I believe. So, moving on from heroes, we've filled in our hero cap. I'll turn on unit caps just so that makes a bit more sense. Don't ask why the Brave Shaman doesn't count as a hero, that's just a CA bug, ignore that. We'll of course move on to the front line. Now, if you look back at our Beastmen replays, there's a few different front lines you can bring. In my opinion, this one would probably be something along the lines of Ungor Herd, 2 Bestigor Herd, and then some Chaos Spawn. Now here, Chaos Spawn function more as a frontline support as opposed to their own individual monsters, like you would from a Giant or a Gorgon. In this situation, Chaos Spawn and Ungor Herd are more than enough to cleave through most Empire infantry, because it's all quite lightly armoured, and all isn't that good, to be fair. Apart from Great Swords would probably be the only thing that could really threaten this as a combo. Looking at the cost here, we have 800, 1600, 1800 plus 1600 at 3400 on the front line. Now these Bestigor units, while they are an infantry unit, they are very fast and they have a specific role in this army, and that is to kill cavalry. Don't ask me why, but Bestigor Herd will defeat Empire Knights and Reichsguard and Knights of the Blazing Sun on the charge. Yes, even Knights of the Blazing Sun will die on the charge, even though they have the greater charge bonus. It's mainly due to the infantry bugs, but in this situation we can reliably use Bestigor Herd as a substitute for cavalry that we normally would. Typically, putting aside the fact that heavy cavalry and just cavalry in general isn't doing great these days, a normal situation when things hopefully balance out quite a bit, we'll be looking at something like, we could go Centaur's Great Weapons and some throwing axes, maybe mix in a couple Poison Hounds. You very much want to focus on the mobility, as you are the Beastman faction. You always have to consider what is your faction's strengths and weaknesses, what is the map I'm playing on, what is the faction I'm fighting. Those are the three main things to consider before you start building your army. You can sometimes consider them after you've built your army and then just tweak and adjust where you need to. But those are the three pillars of what to consider when you're building your army. What am I playing, what is my enemy playing, and what map am I on? Sometimes the map can have no effect. There are certain maps that have very little impact on the game, but there are also those that can completely change depending on what... They can completely turn in your favour or against you depending on what army you bring into it. Beastmen into Empire, you very much want to focus on mobility. You want to overwhelm as quickly as possible so you can get into those missile units, because that is mostly where the Empire's strength is. You also want a reliable armor piercing and a decent hero to take down things like Volkmar. Throwing axes can also assist with that, as can the Centaurs with great weapons, all of which are also very good at killing Empire infantry. Chaos Warhounds are there to chase off skirmish cavalry, like Outriders and Pistoliers, and they're also there just to kill them, because if they poison them, they aren't going to get away. And Chaos Spawn and Ungor are there just to generally kill the front line, because it's only really Empire Great Swords that are going to do anything to them. And then we still have 731 gold, which we can use to just bring however much we want of something else. Whether or not we want to upgrade some of our Ungors to War Gors, or just Gors even. Or if we want to, say, replace something with an ROR, so we want to bring the ROR throwing axes. Or we want to bring a few more spells, or we want to change the mount to upgrade it to a Razor Gore. Don't upgrade it to a Razor Gore, test scores are way better. It just depends all on what you need or what you want, what you feel like doing. While it is certainly a lot down to what's good, don't be afraid to just do something just because you feel like it. Just bring something because it seems cool. Grog Hooves of Wolf's Run, in my opinion, aren't that good, but they seem pretty cool. They have regeneration, and who doesn't like regeneration on a skirmish cavalry unit? So, always consider what you're playing, what the enemy's playing, what the map is, and just what you feel like bringing. We'll take another look at one last situation, and then we'll go into a quick, see if I can't get a quick battle going, just so I can run through the motions in a real life scenario. Let's see. What's a good map? Actually, no, I've got a good one. Where was it? Ash Plains series. So, looking at this, a very flat map. Perfect for missile factions. So we'll go ahead and do Vampire Coast versus the Dark Elves. So, again, let's run through the motions. What are we playing? We're playing as Vampire Coast. They are very strong missiles. Ideally, they want to be on a nice flat map. Perfect situation for them. They also have quite a good Lord selection, which works out against the Dark Elves mostly, because... Actually, no, it doesn't really, because they have a lot of armor-piercing missiles. We want to make sure we have a nice small target Lord, so they don't get completely destroyed by Shades and Dark Shards and that sort of thing, and Reaper Bolt Throwers. And if we consider what is the Dark Elves, what are the main combinations that we can do to suffer Dark Elves? They have quite tight formations, they have quite light armor, so lightly armoured mortars, they'll do quite well. Depth Guard, Wolves, etc, etc. Always have to consider what that is, what we're playing, and then we look at the map. Perfect flat map. Boom. Cannons will do quite ideal, although the Reaper Bolt Throwers do out-snipe cannons, which is an important thing to bring into the equation. That also goes for Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers. They, generally speaking, usually can out-snipe cannons, but there is ways we can combat that. So, starting off with a Lord, I think a good option would be Noctilus on foot. If you bring him on the Necrofex, he's just going to be too easily sniped, because it's a nice flat map, there's nowhere really to hide him either. So you just need to keep him a small target, keep him hard to hit, and just keep him in the middle of your formation, preferably further in the back though. Spell-wise, we'll just do whatever. The summons are very good, preventing skirmish cavalry and cavalry from flanking into the back. Of course, again, we have our Lord and our hero and our caster all wrapped up in one, so we don't need an additional caster. He also has access to the best spells, these two, so you don't really need any more. That should be it for us. I'm going to bring a gunnery white, because it is possible to outsnipe Reaver and Eagle Claw bolt throwers if we give our cannons increased accuracy, which on a flat map like this, we do want to try and take full use of our cannon advantage. So that's what I'm going to do in this build. So we'll go with just enhanced ballistics, no items. Of course, depth guard would be quite good against most of the Dark Elf stuff. The only problem is they don't have any shields, so all that armor-piercing missiles will do shreds to them. They'll just completely destroy them. So probably not a good idea to bring them. Sirens can be a good idea. Dark Elves aren't typically bringing that much magic damage. The only thing you really need to worry about with Sirens would be Doomfire Warlocks, but they themselves are a fairly bad matchup into this because they have no shield and they have very poor armor, so they would just generally just get gunned down. So you can probably bring Sirens, but it is important to consider that your enemy can bring units to combat them. So as long as you keep them out of the way of those magic dealing units, they should be okay. They should ideally do as best they can. Cheap zombie gunnery mob will clear up cavalry quite nicely, and they'll also do quite good against things like Sister the Slaughterer, Witch Elves, even Dread Spears. They don't have that much armor, and they only have silver shields, but even then, it's decent damage for a 300 gold unit. And with that extra powder, they can do even better. Plus, if you throw in the reload spill. Oh, it's Psycho. How are you doing, Psycho?
Okay.
Good to hear. Just running through some army building tips and tricks.
Okay.
As we do, I've pointed out the 3 main pillars to consider is what you're playing, what the enemy's playing, and what map you're on. I thought that was a good 3-pillar thing to consider when you're building your army.
That's true.
Always important to consider your own strengths and weaknesses, what your enemy's weaknesses and strengths are, and then what the map is, because if you're on a flat map with a bunch of artillery, it's going to go pretty well for you. So, just like I was saying, obviously the Vampire Coast, pretty good ranged generally, so carronades would work very well on this map. In tandem with a gunnery white, you should be able to outsnipe Reaver bolt throwers with the enhanced ballistics, the accuracy, even if they're at the very maximum of their range. Actually, I think cannons outrange Reaver bolt throwers by a little bit, 350, and cannons have 450. So yeah, in this situation, then
most like great cannons and stuff tend to be able to outrange a lot of those crossbows and bolt thrower weapons. The problem is that the elven bolt weapons tend to be one spread out, and they don't have like a crew all blobbed at the back.
Yeah, and they're quite small targets as well.
Yeah,
and
so
on top of that, they're quite accurate.
It's deceptively good at not being destroyed.
Yeah, in this situation, you can prepare for that though. To counter that, you can here we have the gunnery white with enhanced ballistics, so that accuracy will be increased. And one thing that you can do when you get into the battle is make sure that your carronades are... just deploy your army very far back, so that your carronades can make full advantage of their range, and their bolt throwers won't be in range at the very start of the battle. That way they have to move into range, you're more likely to be able to kill them before they even get into range. Because there's nowhere to hide on this map. It's a completely flat map, there's no way they'll be able to hide their Reaper bolt throwers on the advance. So as long as you take full advantage of your range, you give your cannons full accuracy, they should be able to outsnipe them before they're even in range. Which can work out quite well to turn this matchup from something that can be quite even to very much favoured for the Vampire Coast. If you make proper use of the range of the map and certain tools that the heroes can bring, we have the enhanced ballistics with working with carronades, everything can turn out quite nicely. But of course, when you have this many cannons, and you need to make sure you have good things to defend them from fast moving like Dark Riders.
Like good old Noctilus.
Yeah, Noctilus on foot here, just so he can summon up those zombies, just to be as chaff. And then I suppose, I don't know, what could you put in the back line? You could put Mongols, you could put some, just some scurvy dogs that you can have either as a flank or in the back, or just good old fashioned polearms maybe.
Well, because the thing is, you'd want something that can hold back potentially a cavalry charge.
Yeah, like cold ones is probably worst case scenario. Or Doomfire Warlocks could also
If
happen.
we're talking about after they fix the problem with the infantry.
Yeah, after that, yeah. But even then, there's not that many infantry good options for the coast in this situation, so they don't benefit from that quite as much. Crabs are also quite a good option, although they are quite weak to the armor-piercing missiles in this matchup, so I might recommend Mongols. Despite the fact they're anti-infantry, they'll beat Dark Riders easily. And if you throw in a chaff unit of zombies as well, they should be able to beat Gold Ones.
Like, let's be real, Dark Riders are just like...
Yeah, they're chaffy, really bad
chaffy
cavalry. Yeah.
They're effectively skirmish cavalry without the range weapons.
Yeah, without any ranged weapons. I mean, there is a ranged weapon variant of them, and they have very similar stats, so that just goes to show.
Except even worse melee stats.
Yeah.
The only reason, like, their charge bonus is okay, so they can kind of do some damage.
Yeah, but with how charges are these days, with their heavy cavalry, it's not great.
Well,
probably the counter charge from zombie pirate deckhands would do more damage than they would, so...
Which is the most depressing part about that.
It's quite sad, yes. Well, obviously, if we look at some of the big monsters, obviously one reason why you don't bring Noclus on is the Necrofex that we did before. All the armor-piercing missiles that Dark Elves have, Shades especially, because you can't kill them because they're quite hidden. They are quite a problem to deal with for the coast. We can you could just cannon them down, or we can bring mortars to whittle them down piece by piece, or you can bring the Mongols along with Direwolves to be able to flank. Direwolves on their own will probably lose the Shades, but in tandem with Mongols you should be able to win that matchup. Or you could just shoot them with Karens. If after you deal with their bolt throwers and their Lord and their caster, your Carronades could just shoot into Shades, really.
Especially because if you got Fellbats, you can use them to spot the unit as well.
Yeah, just
like
to tie
a single unit of Fellbats can just get them into range because they won't run away.
No, they won't run.
Shoot them, but they're very small targets and fast moving, so just run them back and forth or a little. They'll survive just long enough for the cannons to do their work.
Yeah, at least. Literally, Fellbats these days just act as spotters for the Vampire Coast.
Yeah,
they are the spotting unit. Spot all those hidden.
If you're afraid of someone bringing something hiding, you would want to bring
just one. Just one. Just one Fellbat before you usually be enough. If you're worried about some sneaky units, say against Lizardmen, you're worried about a really good counterplay to the Coatl is just to bring a unit of Fellbats. All of a sudden it doesn't work because it can't catch the Fellbats, and so the Fellbats can just reveal anything that's underneath the Coatl. And then all of a sudden you can just use your cannons to shoot whatever's underneath the Coatl and nothing can change.
Yeah.
So quite a useful unit for spotting and for checking forests. Just generally finding things. Worst case scenario, they're a unit of Fellbats, you can use them to tie something down. Always got to consider the uses for every single individual unit in your roster to see if it's a good match for the current situation. Does it work on the map? Does it work against my enemy? Does it work for me? Is it something I actually want to bring, or I'm any good with?
I guess we could use another example faction. Go to Norska.
Oh yeah, Norska. Norska, of course, very limited in its Lord options. We'll do it against Bretonnia. So.
But Wolfric's, yeah.
Yeah, but generally speaking, actually in this matchup, Throg can actually be a better option than Wolfric. Generally speaking, Wolfric's always the option, but as you can see, it's a very limited Lord selection. So it's not like you have that much options, but...
but the casters are...
It's fairly obvious you can see when you've got Wolfric, Mammoth, he's anti-infantry, Throg, anti-large, with the Bretonnia-focused cavalry army. Yeah, generally you want the anti-large Lord.
Yeah, and the only downside is Throg's low armor will make him very vulnerable to... That's the only thing I would worry about. Like, you can have Wolfric on foot or something, potentially.
Or even on horse.
Yeah, or on a horse. Where he's able to just sit and fight.
Yeah, not much can really do much to him, because there isn't a lot of... They don't really tend to bring armor-piercing anti-infantry against Norska, which is what Wolfric is, armoured infantry on foot.
And you slap him with and then you could bring something. Well, the Marauders themselves have Spearmen as well. Yeah,
you can bring Spearmen and Marauder are quite a good option in this matchup because they'll still beat Men at Arms, I think, on a 1v1.
Yes, because of rage.
Yeah, because of rage. Because they'll hold out for that long, they'll actually get like to stage 3 rage. And they also do very good against cavalry.
Yeah, and a lot of the Bretonnian cavalry also have like bronze shields, which makes Axors really good.
Yeah, Axors, hunters with that shield breaker. once they get into the Marauder Spears and they get stuck, you can just go ahead and throw some X's.
Yeah, and because like bringing an infantry infantry North army isn't a bad idea because a lot of the infantry can hold its own.
No, yeah, not at all. Yeah, no. These days, in this matchup, it probably is a better idea. You do want to throw in maybe a Familiar Great Weapon too. Familiar Great Weapons, I think, really do really well in this matchup.
If you got Wolfric on foot, one of the things you can do is blob the Famir with them and use Fight or Die if anything gets remotely close to them.
Yeah, so they get that huge melee attack.
Yeah, same with Throg, which it turns the Famir Great Weapons into punk bitches into where did my cavalry go?
Yeah, really quickly. And there's certain units that in matchups where you just see how perfect they are for the situation. For mere great weapons, they deal magic damage, so they ignore that physical resistance a lot of Batonia units have. They're armor sundering, so your non-armor piercing spearmen will do even better against those heavily armored knights.
Or if you got javelins.
They're already armor piercing, so they'll cleave through knights on their own. And they're anti-large, so they'll do even better against knights. And then on top of that, they have 110 armor and 20% missile resistance, so those peasant archers will do nothing to them.
Yeah, will be less effective.
Yeah, much less effective. Basically,
the only fear, to be fair, it's not the cavalry that you'd have to worry about. It's just the archer spam, which can be dealt
archer spam can be dealt with. Yeah, with wolves and such.
One of the things I was going to point out is that if you're against something like Wood Elf, like Norska is probably one of the meanest factions to use against some poor Wood Elf player, because especially in a tournament too, because wolves and Norscan Ice Wolves, like Hounds and Ice Wolves, aren't the same unit. So you can bring 4 and 4.
You can bring a lot of them.
And
while still adhering to unit caps.
Yeah, this is a few.
Although for some reason Beast of Tashnir got a price increase, didn't they?
Yes, they did. They got, I think, 100 or 50 gold price increase.
Didn't realize they had Frenzy. Did they always have Frenzy?
Yes.
That's a lot of melee attack then, I guess, lads. That's 14. That's a lot of melee attack they have, actually.
Yeah.
No wonder they're so expensive.
Pretty much any Wood Elf player that decides that they're not going to bring any frontline units or they're going to bring a skirmish army will lose. Just having 4 units of Hounds and 2 units can also run down their army faster than they can kill it.
Yeah, and obviously in that situation, Wolfric with a shield would do better than Throg.
Usually you could probably get rid of the spearmen and just bring 3 units.
Yeah, regular marauders with a shield.
Actually, you could bring champions because they're.
Oh yeah, champions would do a lot better because they're armored as well.
Yeah, they're armored and also would be if they did bring dryads, the champions will flat out win.
Yeah, they'll definitely win. I think they'll beat nearly. I think they'll even beat a Tunnel Guard. Not a Tunnel Guard. What's the Wildwood Rangers?
Oh, they would. Yeah.
They would also beat a Tunnel Guard. Yeah. I was just thinking of first unit.
But yeah, and then a couple Wolfric with them, and it's
even
fine,
War Dancers they might beat.
War Dancers might be a problem, but you got Wolfric there.
Yeah, they're not armor piercing. That's the thing.
Remember, don't forget a caster.
Oh yeah, caster of course. Gassy.
Yeah.
Classic Willow mover.
Fire or something.
Yeah, you always have to consider what it is. So if we're looking at the Bretonia, if we go back to the Bretonia matchup chat for this.
If it's Bretonia,
probably want Shadows.
Metal.
Or metal. Yeah, Shadows are metal.
Yeah.
Pits of Shade can function very well to just thump up and destroy units of cav. Pendulums also do pretty well at that. Miasma can slow them down and deal deep damage, and Feebling Foe can mean that Throg can beat pretty much any Bretonian Lord. And if not, go metal. You can reduce even more armor.
Yeah.
Searing Doom also does pretty decent damage. And Final Transmutation can destroy Bretonian blocks.
Transmutation of Lead is the last though.
Oh yeah.
Which reducing the melee attack of especially Shock Cav, who don't have a lot of melee attack.
They don't have a lot of armor piercing either.
Yeah, and they don't.
So their base would be more of a hit to.
Yeah, you drop especially people who just have them put together as one blob trying to charge in. You pop that and suddenly their charge does no damage because 30% of all their damage goes away and they just miss all their hits.
Yeah, it definitely works out a lot better.
Yeah. And it lasts 38 seconds, so
yeah.
They lose.
Always consider what spells work in favour of your strengths, disadvantage of your enemies.
Also, I guess you can bring like a Wolfskin guy to fight cavalry.
Yeah, Skin Wolf Werekin would also work quite well, even just against the Lords as well. Although you already have the anti-large with Throg, he can give that extra missile resistance and armor in case you're worried about the missile spam.
If you got he could go with Throg as like a bodyguard,
Yeah,
and
you
that
could do.
can help him take
With the
out
Famir
other.
as well.
Yeah.
When you pair that with Famir, they get to like 133 armor, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 133 armor they'll get to, along with 30% missile resistance.
Yeah, and also Throg would need some too because of his lower.
Yeah, you'd get a bit extra missile resistance. He already has 15%, so that's another 10% on top of that, so 25%.
But the other thing is that maybe he could actually go and beat down some of the weaker Bretonian lords.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Also, single entity with generations.
Yeah, single entity with regeneration is always a good thing to have.
Yeah, I don't know. Like we said in the session with Norska, Norska does have a lot of versatility and is usually okay against most factions. It only has like what, one, two, or three really like just bad, because most of the bad matchups are just bad. And
Yeah,
not
most of them are just
completely-
bad. None of them are really, really bad.
Yeah, none of them are like an instant lose. You can still win if your opponent is like worse than you.
Yeah,
or
it's
you
not like Bretonia into
catch them off
into
guard
dwarves
with a
or something.
yeah. And Norska doesn't want to fight dwarves because they.
Yeah, there
Well,
is an important thing to notice. There is some situations where you just shouldn't pick a certain faction. Like if your
Yeah.
opponent's picking dwarves, don't pick Bretonia. I can't
No.
give you any advice to help you win that. There's nothing I can do. It's a lost cause.
Maybe back in the day you could before the DLCs.
Maybe
Dwarves
if
got.
your opponent is like AFK, you could do something. But even then, it's
No,
no.
even if they're AFK, they'll still win.
Yeah, you probably But yeah, that is. I'm going to call that there for today. This has obviously been a shorter session than normal because it's just basically on army building tips and tricks, compositions and guides. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again next week for something. I haven't figured out what yet. Maybe we'll go and do some quick battles just so I can show my own sort of army building. I don't know. I'll figure something out.
You could play one quick battle.
Yeah, but I'm really worried. I'm really worried about
Really
actually doing quick battles because I did some the
Why?
other day, and oh boy, it wasn't good.
How bad? How bad
Oh boy, it wasn't good.
was it? Was it just nothing but really?
It wasn't good. Like the first one was a kite game that went for 10 minutes, and the second one he left. The third one he left. The fourth one he left. The fifth one he left. The sixth one.
Was it the same guy?
I think the sixth one was decent. But if I have to wait 6 quick battles before I get into a decent game,
yeah,
I'll see if I can get some replays and do some things about that. But
fix your game, CA.
one day they will. Anyway, thank you all for
No, they
watching,
won't.
and we'll end that now. See you all next week. Goodbye.
They haven't fixed it for 10 years.
Oh.